Hey there everyone. Today I would like to discuss Werner Hamacher's 95 Theses on Philology, the first of two essays that can be found in his Minima Philologica. This short but incisive treatise is an attempt to radically reform the way we view the study of texts. In particular, it wants to see textuality, language, and all of its tools as something foregrounded but not forestalled, not enclosed by theory. And he wants to try to find a way of analyzing and approaching texts that accepts their radical discontinuity, their play. And thus he's going to be primarily responding to and influenced by Derrida's school of deconstruction. He's going to be focusing on the way that language is a structure which is defined by and in which play occurs, where words constantly disseminate outwards through a chain of signifiers, where signification is always deferred to other signifiers in a chain of differential marks, as Derrida puts it, and the fact that temporality in the process of reading is first and foremost the object of any study of texts. These 95 Theses are in a series of short aphorisms, which are at once often elusive and yet at the same time very insightful, in my opinion. He speaks of a sheer speaking to and for, zu sprechen, without anything spoken of or addressed, without anything intended or communicated. And we can see at the very start that Hamacher is attempting to wrest something that seems to be indefinable, that seems to be beyond any one unitary attempt at explanation. And what he's doing is very similar to what Derrida is doing in his work, where he says that, contrary to popular belief, signification can work without a signifier, which is to say, without some concept of which particulars are a general participant in. This would be the Platonic idea, that the reason I can talk about books is because there is the signifier, which would be the word book, and then the signified being the concept of bookness, and then the referent would be the particular object in the world. And Derrida says, actually, we can just signify without having to have a signified in the world somewhere in some strange realm of ideas. That essence does not precede the multiplicity and the iterability of language, and therefore signification can do without a lot of the things that we thought up until then were constraining language, such as intention. And this doesn't mean that there is no kind of force behind every utterance, that I don't come with some vague idea of what I want to do when I speak, but rather that there is not capital I intention, that there is no one intention, but that there are multiple intentions, each of which are fragmentary and partial. Again, partial in the dual sense of incomplete and also biased. And it can also do without some particular referent in the world, right? I can talk about books without talking about a particular book. I can be talking about the idea of what does it mean to write a book, or what really makes a good book. So a lot of the things that language can do without, we can see Hamacher trying to talk about. That there's no one object that philology needs speak to, about, or with regards to, that that object is always under a further consideration, such that language can function without a discrete addressee, without the intention to deliver what is, and without the need to communicate discrete packets of information. We can have some vague idea of what we want to communicate, and in the process of communication, we realize that every utterance is lacking insofar as it fails to measure up to a supposed intention which lies behind it, which foregrounds and supposedly exhausts and makes sense of it. Hamacher is trying to say that language is beyond any of these discrete reductions that we try to make of it. As such, even the very object of philology is one that is lacking in this regards. He says that the idea of philology, like the idea of language, forbids us from regarding them as something had, eine habe. Language is without a finite object and is itself a non-finite category, an aperion. What he's trying to say here is that language is not an object. It's not some thing that we could reduce as if it already existed, and our job as literary critics, as philologists, as scholars, is to merely discretize that thing. Hamacher is saying that the fundamental object of philology is precisely many objects, none of which can be said as more fundamental than the other in an absolute sense, and that we are constantly developing language in the process of its own study. Therefore, he also says that it's not an object of representation. Our goal in philological scholarship, in literary criticism, in philosophy, is not merely to represent something pre-existing. It's not as if we are merely trying to reference or index some object merely present in the world, but rather it is also a question of creation. And key for Hamacher's project is the idea that language and its study needs to be open to difference, and that philology, as such, is always opening up. It reminds me of Heidegger discussing the idea of a Lichtung, of a clearing, and that this is what being is, that it opens up and frees things to be as they are, that it is fundamentally positive insofar as it has the active quality of opening up and revealing, and yet it does not solely reveal, and therefore it's not progressive in the sense of like the Enlightenment progressive ideals of history. It also conceals. It reveals and conceals oftentimes in the same gesture in varying ways. This is the very essence to me of Hamacher's theory. He says philology appeals only to another language, and only towards this other language. It does not proceed from the givenness of a common language, but gives itself to a language that is unknown to it. Out of a language of unknowing, it springs into a form of knowing. It defines itself as the mediation of non-knowing and knowing. So we can see that the very place at which Hamacher is stating and situating his theory is one of an in-between space, of negotiation between things that we would call non-knowledge and things that we would call knowledge. And this is informed by the classical notion in epistemology that knowledge has to do with knowing that. Knowing that this book is green and white and has pink tabs. Knowing that the time is da-da-da-da-da. It is a series of things which could be stated propositionally. It is a question of knowing discrete facts about the world, about knowing fully packets of information and being able to discretely index them and refer to them. This links, for example, with the correspondence theory of truth, that our statements, which are true because they correspond to some object merely present and existing in the world. And Hamacher wants to challenge this, saying that philology is always trying to understand an object which is necessarily other in our very process of discovery. That through language's unfolding, it is always opening up to an otherness, which in a sense it is not, because it is not one thing. It is not, as he said already, an object. We might say rather that it is a dynamic happening, an unfolding, a work in progress, as Joyce might call it. Therefore, we're trying to mediate between what is typically seen as knowledge, knowing that, and knowing how, or simply know-how. The perfect example of this would be habits. I habitually thumb through the pages of my book. But if you asked me, do I know how to flip through the pages of my book, with the thought here being knowledge in this discrete, sense of having propositional knowledge? No. I could formulate propositional knowledge after the fact and say, well, yes, you have to do your thumb like this and scrape and slide by the page in such a way that the pressure is, I could attempt to come up with that. But every propositional form, and this is key for Hamacher, is inadequate. It is partial. And therefore, The knowledge of the text that we're trying to come up with in philology is not one of this restricted formal knowledge, but also this informal knowledge of habit, of merely being attuned to a text or familiar with a text without knowing it in such a way that we are reducing it. And Hamacher is trying to ride these two, of course, because we're using language, often very specific language, even if it's not always the most clear, in order to analyze and probe into these texts. So we're trying to really straddle this line where no one solution, either sheer specificity and programmatic, systematic, propositional knowledge, that's not going to work. But neither is completely unfettered knowledge of something unknown, right? Neither of these are going to work. As such, the desire for language cannot be restricted to the forms of knowledge. Since it is itself the advocate of this desire, it is close to the conjecture that forms of knowledge are only stations of this desire, not its structure. So we can see that at the heart of language for Hamacher is this idea of desire, that language is productive through, by, and with desire. Thus, this is making me think of Deleuze and Guattari's idea of desiring production, which I've done a lecture on if you're curious. As such, this desire is properly in the mode of excess, of, as the French would call it, jouissance. It is a sort of pleasure of the text that goes beyond a mere instrumentalization. Therefore, in the process, we are learning how to appreciate and elucidate texts in a way where all propositions are not only capable of addition, but also in want of it, as he says. Right? There's always an excess we are on the verge of discovering, and we must use often excessive and sometimes elusive and allusive means to achieve this. And this is difficult because it's hinging on a notion of textuality, of linguisticity, if that's even a word, which it's not, where there's always a structure which eludes us, and in which our study is at best structured by an evasive structure. He says, philology cannot find any secure, coherent, or constant ground in the structure of poetry. It must therefore, albeit as an advocate for the cause of poetry, speak with another voice than of poetry, as divination, conjecture, interpretation. Its fundamentum in re is an abyss. So we can see that this abyss at the heart of language, which he's going to be developing here, might be best thought of as the pregnant pause that ends Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. Finnegan's Wake ends in the middle of a sentence after the word the. No punctuation to finish it off, merely a fairly substantive blank space on the page. But this is a pregnant pause at the end of a text, which is signaling rejuvenation and cyclicality, that there is no such thing as an absolute end, and hence the attempt to show that precisely not by revealing it, by merely opening up an incomplete space, which is thereby contested. This is the way that Hamacher wants to think of the structure of poetry and the structure of language. That it is open-ended, it leaves us with a question which it incisively does not deliver an answer to, because philology is not about answers. It's not about providing solutions, as if it was a math problem. Rather, it's a series of open-ended questions, which their objects are not necessarily discretely known, and we don't even necessarily know the precise formulation of the question, because there's always ambiguity in all language. As such, fundamental to his method is a style of conjecture and interpretation, which is grounded in empirical facts about the text, but a text whose empirical nature is precisely not discretely reducible to one state of things. It is always in excess of our statements of facts about the structure of poetry and language, for example. Therefore, there is an abyss which is something like a pregnant pause, which prompts us to further elucidate and experiment with the text. And this idea of experimentation seems to me really important, although he never actually uses the word experimentation or its translational equivalent. But I think that one would do well to compare him to the American pragmatists, who want to understand knowledge and truth and reality, all these concepts, as something that we need to experiment and yet tarry with nonetheless. That they are incisive for our political institutions, for the way we interact with our communities, for the way we read texts, for the way we think of knowledge philosophically. All of these demand an experimentation with no end date, right? Therefore, words first can only overtake what is said by the other one, überholen. They speak for themselves asunder, and speak their asunder. This also reminds me of Finnegan's Wake, where Joyce is constantly discussing the phoenix as an emblem of both rising and falling, because Finnegan's Wake is itself about waking, about rising, about arising from sleep, and yet also awake, a funeral. So this sort of contradictory, paradoxical movement is the kind of dialectic of revealing and concealing, of explicating and evading, that is really incisive for understanding Hamacher's theory. He says that for philology, if it is the movement of attending to that which offers itself to this attending, and which slips away from it, encounters or misses it, attracts it, and attracting it, withdraws from it. It is the experience of drawing into withdrawal, the movement of a search without predetermined end, therefore without end, therefore without the without of an end. This is interesting, right? There is not some future predetermined telos which speaks sort of proactively to us, hearkens to us, and tells us where to go with the text, tells us to what end our philological practice is moving. No. We will try to phantasmatically, spectrally create an image of an end, of an ideal of clarity and explication and fullness and completeness that we would assume that our literary project is working towards. But philology here, Hamacher wants to say, is an attending to a thing which is always escaping us, which is always slipping outside of our grasp and within our grasp, right? Is always slipping because it is going away from us into a realm that we do not quite understand. And also, the very thing we're looking at, the very words, and Hamacher's theory is a perfect example of this, is constantly slipping away in the very signifiers that we are looking at, right? Thus, he says that every definition of philology must indefine itself and give way to another. This is deconstruction straight up, right? The propositional language is provisional and partial, and shall be effaced in the process of reading, writing, and interpretation. There is no final saying on things, but rather there is the dynamic interplaying of sayings. This is a very interesting passage for understanding the way that Hamacher is really foregrounded by Derrida's concept of différance. Différance being a play on difference, to differ from things, and also to defer, as in to forestall some opinion to some future date. He says logical affect, and he's referring to a previous quote of Schlegel's. In Schlegel's etymological elucidation of philology may mean affect for language, but also affect of language, thus affect of language for language. So he's concerned with affect theory, right? With the way that texts affect us. It joins with itself as another, departed from it or ahead of it, solely in its affect, its enthusiasm. And this idea of enthusiasm is really interesting because this is what I try to bring to texts. Not because I feel some inherent sort of spiritual motivation, but because these texts have an enthusiasm of their own. They're so exciting because they are excited about themselves. When I read Finnegan's Wake, for example, I get this affect of enthusiasm. And I think this enthusiasm for texts is something that Hamacher is trying to show philology has precisely because the object of philology is fundamentally excited, excessive, and enthusiastic. Only through division can it join itself with that from which it is divided. Philology is inclination not only for another empirical or potentially empirical language, but for the otherness of language, for linguisticity as otherness, for language itself as perpetual alteration. Right? So we have difference through différence. This reminds me of Joyce's notion of iteration and perpetuation in Finnegan's Wake, where we have a number of motifs that repeat themselves over and over, but without some sort of prime original form of the motif, which is then varied. So it's not a theme in variations, but rather it's variations without an original. It's copies without an original, and therefore it's a sort of hyper-real, right? A reality without an objective referent, which conditions that reality and the supposed referentiality of the statements or the signification therein. So it's a perpetual alteration of gestures without an original from which we can compare to what extent are they similar or different, to what extent are they altered. It's just a perpetual alteration within and without. And I think this really captures the radical openness of texts, which is the whole reason we read in the first place and also the very curse of reading. As it exceeds every given language, so philology, in addition and pretensions, doubts and demands, exceeds every representation of its own history. It transforms the given into the movement of giving. Right? The text is actively giving us something which evades our grasp and yet nevertheless allures us. I think of Timothy Murphy's idea of fascination in his William Burroughs and The Secret of Fascination. I think this is really what the texts are trying to do, is infatuate us in this strange way that commands us inwards and yet doesn't accept us totally. There's always some provisional holding out. And this is the reason that we can continue to talk about language ad infinitum if we want to. But crucially, this does not mean that anything goes. I think this is an important misconstrual of deconstruction, which assumes a sort of idealism it does not have. Just because we recognize that there is no final signification does not mean that signification is whatever we want it to be. No, it precisely means that signification is only its immediate contingencies, only its contextual ambiguities, only its radical openness in the here and now, which demands that it be read as one way, in such a way that it is always opening up concretely, not abstractly and in a way which wholly evades us, but rather it keeps us tethered in such a way that the text pulls us along, commands us to follow certain threads, without reducing our analysis to any one thread. For philology, language does not exhaust itself in the sphere of means. It is not mediation without being at the same time a leap, not transmission without being at once its diversion or rupture. And thus also for philology itself, chopping copula, chopula. And I think this is perfect, right? This is what we do when we study text, is we chopulate. It reminds me of Derrida's concept of citational grafting, that one of the fundamental reasons that signification can occur at all is the fact that context does not restrain or restrict language, but actually is its sole fetter which language is constantly escaping. Any one context can be superseded by us taking some citation, grafting out of its context, putting it into a new context, and quoting it anew, putting it in between citational marks or quotation marks. And in so doing, we show that language always can rupture, has the capacity for rupture, can always divert and has the capacity to divert from any one context. Therefore, it is always chopping itself, chopped off from itself, and therefore fragmented, split in the properly sort of Lacanian sense. Since language exceeds itself infinitely and discontinuously, the end of philology, therefore, must be the leap of language. Right? So language itself is therefore a leap, both a leap of faith, but also an active leaping. It is the dancing God which Nietzsche speaks of when he says, "I could only believe in a God who could dance." Language is that God, precisely because it is not transcendent, because it is a polytheistic, Pentecostal eruption of polyvocal expectations and voices and caricatures and icons, right? It totally violates any notion of supremacy or absolute hierarchy, but rather philology and language always leap and explode into and beyond us and thereby compel us. This to me seems a properly Derridian statement. This is number 48. If language speaks for a meaning, it must also be able to speak in the absence of meaning. If it speaks for an addressee, then it must also be able to speak in the absence of an addressee. If it speaks for something, it must also be a for without a something, and without the particular for that would be predetermined for it. Right? So we do not need some meaning pre-packaged that conditions the gesture. Rather, we can have gesture in which meaning is formulated in the very process of gesture. This is the very essence of the performative, right? Of the illocutionary gesture. That it accomplishes its very content through its formal erupture. Through its explosion, it commits precisely what it needs to. It's like a sword jab. If it has an addressee, a place to which it is going, it also can speak without that particular addressee, right? Because language basically goes beyond any one referent, beyond any one referential index that we might impose upon it. And it can speak for something, that is to say, on behalf of something, without necessarily predisposing us to think of one something. There is always multiple voices being accounted for in philology. Thus, this makes me think of Sheldon Breivik's idea that Finnegan's Wake always accounts for and speaks for multiple voices. And in this way, I agree that Finnegan's Wake is like all other texts, all other significatory acts. It accommodates multiplicity and demands that multiplicity be enacted. Funnily enough, Hamacher speaks of Joyce. He says that the philologist thereby writes, as Joyce did on a larger scale and more deliriously in Finnegan's Wake, another philology. He speaks of what he calls objet instead of objet. So instead of object, instead of a thing, we have this objet, which is the object that preserves in play its freedom, not to ossify into the object of a subject. That is, something which is of and for one particular subject. And also not a discrete object, right? It's an event, a happening, a structure which is constantly evading and moving, a body without organs, we might say. It is the counterplay against the objectification of a thing by naming it. Each word and language as a whole must be such an objet. In the objet, language plays against language. Philology, which like all language, is a language about language and therefore the play of its unpredictable movement. And again, I must stress, this play is not a senseless play. It is not a meaningless play of signifiers that act without fetters. Quite the opposite. It merely says that all fetters have gaps, have holes. That every discourse that we assume to constrain any gesture is in fact partial, historically contingent, and in the process of developing itself. And therefore our goal is to find these gaps and elucidate and explore lines of flight without forestalling them in the process of our speculative search. In regards to meta-language and this idea of language about language, I think this is very incisive. Hamacher says that no trope can designate language without being a linguistic trope, and at the same time not being one. Every assertion about language and every trope for it thwarts itself. Right? When we attempt to index language and define it, we are using something linguistic. And it is a subset of language, but a language which we thereby always irrevocably change when we talk about it because we add to it in some sort of substantive way, small or large as it may be. Therefore, language is always this dynamic structure which thwarts and burns asunder any attempt to reduce it, and yet nevertheless can respond to these attempts at reduction in very differing ways. He says that philology is not merely a there is language. There is also a there is no there is language. It is language that gives itself and language that withdraws itself, or this giving. Right? Language doesn't exist as a presence, as a discrete object, as a there is that we can point to or index. It flees, evades, withdraws, conceals, concedes, occults, differs, right? All of these and more. I think these statements 65 and 66 are really key touchstones for understanding Finnegan's Wake. He quotes, "Et tout le reste est littérature," and all the rest is literature. Philology has to do with the rest named by Paul Verlaine, as well as with the other rest of which it is said in Shakespeare. The rest is silence. And he's making an equivocation right here between the rest as in the leftovers, or as Finnegan's Wake would call them, the litters, which is a play on letters, and litter as in trash, garbage, and also rest as in like a rest in music, right? You have a note value and then you have rests, which are silences. So this is further accentuating the idea of the pregnant pause that I spoke of. It is a silence which speaks in a no tongue. That itself is a little play I'm making up on Notung from Wagner, the sword, right? So this seems to me really incisive for understanding Hamacher, where the pen is mightier than the sword, precisely because the pen is always evading, because it is our instrument and our tool and our means of talking about language, but also our means by which to explore the way that talkings exceed any one about. He says the fact that they say everything about and mean nothing could characterize works that turned out well. They have no outside to which they refer. They contract the world into themselves. As one says of a stone that is contracted matter, so they are contracted world. They are dicht and Gedichte, dense and poems. For this reason, they are not closed and shut off. They also speak, since they say everything, for others and for other times, but they do not denote them, claim no knowledge of them, and none of themselves. This is Finnegan's Wake. It talks without claiming discrete knowledge about what it talks about. It does not denote one thing, but rather it gestures, performs, enacts, points, without indexing or reducing. Right? It says everything and means nothing in particular. Which is to say that it always hints at, without reducing, without giving it to you. Because it's not just about what is said, but how it's said. The very how of the saying is as important as the content of the saying. Very simply, Hamacher says that philology digs out the world. And this seems to me to be, perhaps it's not intentional, a reference to what a nice old nest it all makes, a midden-hide hoard of objects from Finnegan's Wake, where Biddy Doran the hen is digging for a missive, for a letter in a midden heap. And she's taking all of the trash of history and she's collecting it into her knapsack as well. And from this, she is giving us a letter. This also reminds me of Foucault's idea of an archaeology of knowledge, coming from the genealogical method of Nietzsche. This also reminds me of the geology which Deleuze and Guattari speak of in the geology of morals. Right? We're taking all the excess of history, everything which would seem to be beyond our domain, and incorporating it in such a way which we do not reduce it in the process of incorporation, but rather we signal, expose, elucidate, and team out in a way that it's fun. That's what he's trying to do here. Hamacher is trying to show how studying language can be fun. He says that philology follows the pleasure principle as little as does language. There is no plaisir du texte that would not start with repetitions and strive for repetitions. And yet every repetition of an experience also repeats the pain of separation from it, and repeats at the same time the separation from repetition. Repetition thus not only repeats, it releases itself from repetition and dissolves it. It turns to another beginning. That is to say, back to something other than a beginning. It, philology, repetition, does not only turn back, it begins without principle. This also seems to me to reference Finnegan's Wake, which begins in the middle of a sentence. It begins in an open sentence, in medias res, right? This is Finnegan's Wake's idea of circularity, of originality or an origin, which is precisely that there is no Ursprung, right? An originary point of springing or origin. It literally means origin in German. There is no point which is singular, which precedes multiplicity and allows for it to come into existence. This is the idea of arborescence in Deleuze and Guattari's thinking, that all multiplicity requires essence to precede it, and that like a tree, it springs from that single point. Rather, it is rhizomatic. That multiplicity, plurality, polyvocality is the precondition for any attempt to reduce to singularity, for any attempt to essentialize or represent, discretize or index. All of this requires a multiplicity which exceeds any one gesture, exceeds any unitary account. This is the reason that language can repeat, precisely because it is separated from any one repetition, that any one repetition becomes merely a contingency. Therefore, we're not repeating one primary thing, right? Because repeat has in it as in to do again. But it's not some originary gesture that is then repeated. It is merely repeating signification without some originary Ursprung. Philology, he says, is not a part of the world that can trade with or act on another part. It is the movements of its becoming a world, the coming to the world of this world. This coming does not allow itself to be made, to be bargained for, to be achieved through intentional acts. That is, it is not predicated on our intentions. Language doesn't require that the author had a specific intention when he did something. He or she can have a very vague idea of what they want to do, and in fact, hope that by writing it down, their intention will be made retroactively clear. The non-negotiability of this coming of this world is the experience that another philology has to elucidate. Its provisional maxim: act such that you can leave acting. And further, act without a maxim, even without this one. This sort of ironism reminds me of Nietzsche in Also sprach Zarathustra, where Zarathustra speaks of those who will truly know him and what he means happening when they learn to abandon him. So it's a sort of counter-gospel, right? Where instead of preaching maxims to be followed, it is preaching things to be exceeded. It reminds me of Foucault saying, "I say the things I say not because I know them, but so that I will no longer know them." Right? It's a sort of self-destructive attempt to signal something, to open up to something which we know we will burn asunder, and that we will make something new of in the process. And I think that the very theory that Hamacher is trying to elucidate here is something which allows us to open up to the fiery burnings of language. He says, philology would then be attention to that which interpunctuates, brings to a hold, creates caesuras, because without it, something that comes, or its coming, becomes noticeable. Right? We are making the interruptions and the eruptions of the text, of language, of its excess, manifest, focusing on the interpunctuations, which is not to say, not a punctuated propositional statement, but the in-between between those propositions, the way that change happens over time, and thus temporality is really incisive for understanding Hamacher's theory. And he doesn't really get into temporality in here, but I can tell that it's important. And I encourage you, at the conclusion of this, to think about all of these things, including temporality, and consider reading Hamacher. This was made in 2009, so it's pretty recent, and I don't hear Hamacher really ever being discussed. In fact, I only came to the knowledge of Hamacher sort of obliquely and circuitously and by happenstance, but nevertheless I've enjoyed it thus far, and I hope you have too. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you just want to donate to the channel, because I really appreciate anything that you donate. It helps me buy books like this, which I can then present to you, but no pressure. Care for yourself first. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.